الآن كلمة للسيد تروند جنسن رئيس مكتب الأمم المتحدة لتنسيق الشؤون الإنسانية أوتشا في تركيا.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, colleagues, I had a long speech, but Ramesh has actually said most of the things I had intended to say. So I'll try to add a few things to the many wisdoms that he has dispensed over the last 10 minutes. But first of all, I'd like to say a big thank you. Both myself and Ramesh are honoured and in fact delighted to provide remarks at the beginning of your annual conference. So we were asked to provide some words on the various dimensions of your work, on the role of civil society, early recovery, and the role of Syrian women. I think I believe I speak on behalf of the entire international community. We are all humbled by the work you do and your commitment to humanity and the values that you express through your work. And a clear illustration of this, I think, is what happened last week in terms of the tragic events that unfolded during the evacuations of the 4 towns. War and conflict often brings out the worst in people, but it also brings out the best in terms of humanity. Humanitarian workers reaching across the divide to save lives and alleviating suffering is an example of this, and this is what we clearly saw last week and what we see every single day. Syrian NGO workers putting their lives at risk to save those of others. You should take great pride in terms of the work that you do. Conflict and war, as I said, often brings about untold suffering, tragedy, and mayhem. I think few would have imagined the tragic trajectory that should come out of the Arab Spring and the human suffering that has taken place subsequently. In tragedy, there is often hope. And one of the seeds that was sown back in 2011 has blossomed into a diverse, vibrant, and durable Syrian civil society. There are countless, if not thousands, of Syrian NGOs who are working today on the humanitarian response within Syria. And I believe this is a manifestation of the commitment, the initiative, and the courage that you display every single day. I think it's perhaps appropriate to take a step back and reflect on the history of civil society. In the 19th and 20th century, civil society organizations developed to promote the popular vote, democracy, the rights of labor, the emancipation of women, and the promotion of human rights, including that of the rights of children. Promoting many socially progressive causes that we today see as the norm rather than the exception. Many civil society organizations see themselves as the checks and balances on government, as well as righting wrongs in society. Some organizations have been set up to advocate or provide assistance to those less fortunate or those in need. I myself have worked for Save the Children, which was set up in 1919 to deal with the starvation of children in Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire following the First World War. And I think it's a very apt example of people reaching out behind the divide to aid those who were former enemies. Much the same, I've also worked for Oxfam, which was set up as the Oxford Committee for Famine Relief back in 1942 to deal with starvation in Greece, which was then under German occupation. And as we all know, the International Committee of the Red Cross was set up in the mid-19th century to deal with the consequences and the cruelty of war. What these organizations have in common with you and your organizations is that individuals took initiatives based on a sense of conscience, humanity, and solidarity to right wrongs and alleviate the suffering where no other relief was forthcoming. These three words, conscience, humanity, and solidarity, are often words we use to describe the work that you do and what humanitarianism is about. People who care, people who take initiative, people like you. The role that NGOs play in the cross-border humanitarian operation is a significant one, and I think Ramesh has pointed to many of the reasons why. We estimate that 80% of all assistance that goes across the border from Turkey is delivered by non-governmental organizations. And the vast majority of this is through Syrians, through you. In northern Syria and elsewhere where you work, in the absence of government, virtually all basic services are provided through NGOs. Were it not for you, people would not have access to food, protection, water and sanitation, and healthcare. We should also not lose sight of the fact that some of the most effective advocates for the plight of Syrians are Syrians themselves. And I think it's important also to note that NGOs, and particularly Syrian NGOs, are monitoring and reporting on the plights of Syrians, including the breaches of human rights and international humanitarian law. You are the most important watchdog in terms of the atrocities that are happening within Syria. I think another particularly important role that you play is that you mobilize enormous amounts of resources to deal with the current crisis, not just in terms of money, but in terms of yourselves and the work that you do and the countless volunteers that provide services throughout the country. This, I think, is very much enabled by the reach, the access and acceptance that you have in communities with few, if any, other agencies have. And as Ramesh so aptly said, you are also the future of Syria. And when it comes to a transition and a political settlement in Syria, you will all play an important part in the future of Syria. I often make the mistake when I give presentations on the Syrian crisis, I talk about it as a remotely managed operation. I won't do this anymore because it's not a remotely managed operation. You guys are there. You guys are in Syria. You are doing the job. Yes, maybe for international organizations it's a remotely managed operation, but you guys are there, suffering with your fellow countrymen and putting your lives at risk every single day to help those in need. We as OCHA have recognized the critical role of particularly Syrian NGOs, and as a result, we help to facilitate the NGO platform to help build capacity of Syrian NGOs. This is why we also aim to increase funding for Syrian NGOs through our pooled fund. It's a priority for us. And you will recall that during the World Humanitarian Summit, emphasis was put on supporting local actors because they are very often the most effective in terms of bringing assistance to their own communities. This is also why we think that Syrian NGO participation and leadership should be reflected at all levels in our coordination mechanisms. This said, I recognize that we can always improve, and we seek your feedback and input into how we as OCHA can best support you. I mentioned earlier the beginnings of civil society and how we have developed. One point I want to make is that we have developed significantly since those early days. Then, as sometimes is the case today, people in need were treated as passive objects and that received assistance, and that aid givers knew best what was needed. We often talked about aid dependence. Thankfully, we have moved on somewhat. Today, there is an increased emphasis on accountability to those in need. There is also an emphasis on resilience, which is about how we help people better cope with crisis, as well as helping people help themselves through livelihood support and access to basic services. In many ways, we are creating artificial divisions between humanitarian and recovery activities. The aim should always be not just keeping people alive through humanitarian assistance, but also ensuring that people have a life, restoring their dignity and their self-reliance. This is, of course, easier said than done, as you all know. What we do find, however, is that there's often room for what we have labelled, I think somewhat mistakenly, recovery activities at all stages in the crisis. The way we think of aid is also changing. Often, it is better or more appropriate to provide cash handouts to people who have been affected by crisis so that they can make themselves the choices in terms of what the most urgent priorities are. This brings me to the last point I wanted to make. It touches on the gender in humanitarian operations. I do not think that anyone here doubts that there are gender-specific vulnerabilities, whether it relates to gender-based violence or specific vulnerabilities that relates to women or girls. These vulnerabilities often result from practices which we as humanitarians are ill-equipped to address. What we must do, however, is to design our assessments so that we can better understand these vulnerabilities, thoroughly analyze the data so that we can better design programs that overcome these vulnerabilities, and at all stages of our interventions ensure that we have feedback from our intended beneficiaries to make sure that we actually make a difference in their lives. Needless to say, this often requires that services for women and girls are delivered by women. This may help to ensure that assistance and modes of delivery are more appropriate, as well as reducing the risk of abuse. I'm very happy, and I can see she's here, that we have a senior gender capacity advisor to help mainstream and do gender better in our programming. We are also, through our assessments and the humanitarian needs overview, trying to get a better picture of needs and vulnerabilities by disaggregating data by sex and age. We do, however, need to do more in terms of sharing best practices, and more importantly, make sure that our operations, the people we employ, reflect the realities of our societies where women play important roles at all levels, including leadership. The new Secretary General of the United Nations has made it one of his first objectives to address gender imbalances within the United Nations, recognizing that it will improve the organization and how it works in the long run. The point I really want to make on this is that you, as civil society organizations, are in a unique position. Often, the communities where you work, people do not just look to you for assistance. They look to you as role models, as well as for guidance. Women have an important role to play at all levels in humanitarian operations, and I think we all recognize this, from leadership roles to being first responders. Amongst you, there are some great examples of women who provide these leadership roles. Unfortunately, there are very few of you, and this, I think, is work in progress for us as the international community, but also for you as the Syrian civil society. On that note, I would like to thank you again for inviting me, and I wish you a fruitful and rewarding conference. Thank you.